The town of Arkham's Ridge, Massachusetts, never felt like a place one lived in. It felt like a place one was allowed to stand on. Unlike the bustling, neon-lit tourist traps of Salem proper, Arkham's Ridge had chosen silence. It maintained its 17th-century severity. Its clapboard colonial homes painted a weary, unforgiving white, their gables sharp against the perpetual autumn sky. It had no witch museums, no shops selling plastic cauldrons. The hysteria here had been too absolute, too real to be commodified. Elias Thorne, an archivist from Boston, felt this oppressive quiet the moment his tires left the smooth asphalt of Route 1 and hit the cobblestones of Elder Street. He had inherited the town's oldest standing structure, the grim, slate-roofed parsonage, from an uncle he barely knew. Elias had expected quaint history. He got a history that felt less like the past and more like a heavy, cold climate. The parsonage stood on a slight rise, its lawn a patch of sickly yellow grass that refused to bloom, even in June. Legend held that this specific plot was not merely the site of a colonial-era execution, but the spot where the condemned were hastily interred, unmarked, their restless spirits tethered to the very earth. They called it, in hushed tones, Salem's Wood, even though the actual site was miles away. Ungated, by quite chance, the interior entrance talked with a seething, nondescript knee. Inside the parsonage, the air was perpetually stale, thick with the scent of aged wood smoke and something metallic, like old pennies. Elias walked across the wide-planked pine floorboards of the main parlor. They didn't creak so much as groan, a sound that felt less structural and more like a sigh escaping from the foundation. The windows, original panes warped with age, filtered the afternoon sun into sickly, distorted rectangles on the wall. He knew the local narrative. In 1689, 3 people, a young woman, an old farmer, and a runaway indentured servant, had been hanged here after a brief, brutal fit of religious paranoia led by the town's first preacher. The town eventually repented, building the parsonage decades later as a defiant act of renewal. But Elias saw no defiance, only a monument to poor foundations. As he knelt to examine a faint scorch mark by the fireplace, a mark the town historians swore was just soot, Elias felt a distinct, frigid pressure settle on his shoulders, heavy and suffocating. It was not the cold of the drafty house, it was the chilling weight of collective memory. The soil beneath the house, the mortar in the chimney, the very wood of the floorboards, it didn't simply hold history, it was the history. And it was deeply, terribly, unquiet. Elias had come to Arkham's Ridge looking for an inheritance, but he was beginning to suspect that he had become the inheritor of a place where the earth itself had a score to settle. He had yet to find the Devil's Almanac, but he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was standing on the ground where its deadly pact was first sealed. The parsonage was a textbook example of a saltbox house, a style born of economic necessity and stern Puritan aesthetic. Its distinctive long, sloping rear roof, like a slide descending from the second story, was designed to minimize taxes in the early colonial era. But to Elias Thorne, staring up at it now from the perpetually barren lawn, it looked less like a home and more like an architectural manifestation of a heavy sigh. The shorter front facade, clean and defiant, suggested the public face of the community. The long, dark, secretive slope in the back seemed to hide everything else. The interior was where the real preservation began, and where Elias felt the true weight of his inheritance. The previous occupant, his estranged Uncle Silas, a historian obsessed with the town's colonial period, had left everything exactly as it was. There was no modern plumbing, only a dry, cracked basin and a small corner closet. No electricity upstairs. Oil lamps and candles stood ready, coated in dust. It wasn't just old, it was meticulously maintained in its oldness, as if Silas had been trying to keep the 17th century from decaying.
Standard entry about the winter solstice were 3 lines of cramped, spidery script. written in ink that was significantly older, darker, and more iron-rich than Silas's. The script was archaic, almost illegible, but Elias managed to decipher the words. 3 souls to the soil. The mark is given. The harvest waits. The third and most unsettling anomaly was a single folded piece of vellum tucked into the Almanac's centerfold. It was a small drawing, crudely rendered but instantly recognizable. It depicted the parsonage, the saltbox house, but drawn upon the structure were a series of geometric symbols, triangles intersecting circles, and a peculiar stylized S, the same symbol Elias had seen etched lightly into the parsonage's foundation stone outside. The drawing was labeled in the same spidery hand, the seal of the threefold curse. Elias's historian's heart pounded against his ribs. This wasn't just Silas's notes. The Almanac itself was the key. It wasn't the devil's almanac, not yet, but it was the roadmap to it. The pages were missing because the true historical crime, the compact mentioned on Silas's sketch, must have occurred during those excised months. And the cryptic handwriting was too old to be Silas's. It belonged to someone who had lived through the event itself. He carefully spread the vellum drawing on the desk. The symbols and the unsettling title suggested that the house was not just on cursed ground. The house was the curse, built intentionally to trap or contain something dark. The unquiet soil remembered, but the almanac held the coded truth of what the colonial community had buried, and what Elias had now unwittingly unearthed. The discovery in the 1690 Farmer's Almanac, the excised pages, and the chilling archaic script sent Elias to the heavy colonial archives in the nearby town library, not for answers, but for the mindset that birthed the horror. To understand the seal of the threefold curse, he needed to comprehend the darkness that consumed 17th-century Arkham's Ridge. The Puritan settlement of the late 1680s was not merely a community. It was a beleaguered garrison against a hostile wilderness, and far more terrifyingly, against the perceived forces of Satan. Their doctrine was absolute, rigid, and fueled by a constant, paralyzing fear of the unseen. Life was a relentless battle against temptation, and any misfortune, a failed harvest, a sick child, a harsh winter, was interpreted as God's direct judgment, or worse, the devil's subtle intrusion. Elias pored over the journal of Reverend Ezekiel Stone, the man who had ordered the hangings on the parsonage grounds. Stone's writings were a chilling testament to this paranoia. Quote, "We are but frail vessels in the tempest of hell," Stone had scrawled in his cramped hand. "The forests ring with the howling of the savages and the greater, colder breath of the wicked one who seeks to spoil this new Canaan. We must purge the spoilage with fire and certainty, lest the whole venture be cast into the pit." End quote. In this world, suspicion was virtue, and individualism was dangerous. A woman who knew too much about herbs, a man who spoke too freely against the elders, or a servant who practiced old-world folklore was not just eccentric, they were potential conduits for the devil. This atmosphere of stifling conformity was the true engine of the hysteria. The people of Arkham's Ridge believed so fiercely in the devil's omnipresence that they essentially willed him into existence through their fear and their relentless need to find sin. The tragedy of the 3 victims executed in 1689 was rooted in this very strictness. The young woman, Prudence Albright, was accused after she refused the advances of a powerful deacon. The farmer, Jedediah Hook, had protested the seizure of his land.
The indentured servant, whose name Elias still hadn't found, was simply foreign and terrified. They weren't witches, they were dissidents, inconvenient truths in a society demanding
silence. The silence was so profound that it seemed to absorb all surrounding noise, the wind outside, the distant hum of the town, into its crushing void. On the opposite page, one line was written in chillingly clear English, in a firm, educated hand. The price is paid, the land is secure, and the debt shall be collected when the last pillar falls. It was the signature of the compact, the final, undeniable proof that the parsonage was not just a home, but the physical tether of a terrifying, self-perpetuating curse. The Devil's Almanac, chillingly bound and written in pale blood ink, lay open on the desk. Elias Thorne felt a dreadful certainty. The book was the contract, but the house, the Saltbox parsonage, was the shrine. The Almanac's single clear English sentence, "The debt shall be collected when the last pillar falls," was a sinister directive. The compact's pillars Silas had drawn on the map were not structural supports, they were markers for the ritual. Remembering Silas's crude map, Elias focused on the markings, the 3 crosses drawn near the rear of the property, converging at a central spot labeled simply Source. That source had to be the final repository of the curse, the physical location where the Puritan elders had made their vile trade. The map led Elias outside to the patch of sickly, resistant yellow grass behind the parsonage. It was the same ground where the 3 unfortunates were summarily hanged in 1689. Using a thin metal rod, Elias probed the soil where the map indicated the source lay. After several minutes of frustrating work, the rod sank not into soil, but into air, hitting solid rock just beneath. He cleared away the sod and dirt, revealing a thick, circular slab of granite, partially buried and choked with tenacious gray moss. It was heavy, far too heavy to move alone, but Elias's fear was momentarily eclipsed by the desperate need for truth. Using the crowbar as a lever, he strained against the stone. With a scraping, grinding sound that seemed to pull against the very history of the land, the granite slab shifted. A blast of air, damp, cold, and carrying the overwhelming stench of stagnant water and decaying matter, rushed up from the newly revealed opening. Below was blackness, broken only by the faint, slick gleam of water far down. It was a well, or rather, a deep pit that had been covered and forgotten. This was not the drinking well. This was the covenant of the hidden well. Elias knelt at the lip, peering into the gloom. The stone lining was rough, centuries old. He dropped a pebble. The sound of its impact was delayed, muffled, suggesting significant depth. But the well wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a psychological anchor for the haunting. It was where the life force of the victims, the 3 souls to the soil, was poured out to consecrate the bargain that secured the town's future. Searching his pockets, Elias found a coil of thick rope and the battery-powered lantern he'd brought. Securing the rope to a nearby centuries-old oak tree, he slowly lowered the lantern. The cone of light sliced through the darkness, finally illuminating the water. But the light revealed more than water. Just above the surface, where the stone was slick with constant moisture, the same angular, jagged runes from the Devil's Almanac were faintly carved into the stones. The runes encircled the well, forming a permanent underwater seal. The elders had used the well not as a place to draw water, but as a ritual vessel, a silent, deep container for their unforgivable sin. The unholy compact hadn't just taken place here. Its essence was trapped within the well's cold, enduring stone,
forever poisoning the waters and the land above. Elias gripped the rope, realizing he stood at the very epicenter of the curse. The sealed
Almanac. Her forced confession, far from clearing her name, was the essential documentation of the town's own eternal guilt. The weight of Prudence Albright's false confession, a truth twisted into a tool for ritual murder, pressed down on Elias. He knew the Puritan elders had sealed their bargain with the devil through the hidden well, but a nagging question remained. Did anyone in that terrified colonial community try to fight back? Did any soul realize the horror of the compact and attempt to undo it? Driven by this thought, Elias returned to the main parlor, specifically the huge, soot-blackened hearth that dominated the room. The fireplace was the social and spiritual heart of a colonial home, a place of warmth, cooking, and, often, hidden protective magic. He remembered the faint scorch mark he'd noticed on his first day, and, with a fresh surge of adrenaline, began to examine the stone chimney stack. The parsonage had been built decades after the hangings, a supposed act of repentance. But history taught Elias that repentance often came with insurance. He carefully ran his hand over the inner bricks, feeling for any irregularity, any loose mortar. High up, just above the lintel, concealed by centuries of soot, his fingers found a seam. Working with painful slowness, Elias chipped away the darkened mortar with the tip of his trowel. He exposed a brick that was clearly laid differently, mortared hastily and without the precision of the surrounding structure. With a final sharp tug, the brick came loose, crumbling onto the hearth below. In the small dark cavity behind it rested a single artifact, wrapped tightly in a coarse yellowish shroud, a clear glass bottle, small and squat, sealed with a stopper of black wax. It was an unmistakable witch bottle. Elias carefully unwrapped the object. The bottle, though clouded with age, was recognizably 17th century craftsmanship. Inside, its contents were ghastly. A dense coil of oxidized iron nails, a few sharp pieces of broken glass, and what appeared to be a clump of human hair and nail clippings floating in a dark, murky liquid, likely stale wine or urine. This was no ordinary superstition. A witch bottle was an intense act of sympathetic magic, a desperate, final defense against a known hex. The belief was that the trapped nails and glass would prick and torture the witch or the demon, while the hair and nail clippings, often from the victim or the house owner, acted as a magical bait, luring the evil into the sealed bottle. The sheer potency of the bottle's contents spoke of absolute terror. Someone, likely a domestic servant or a desperate neighbor who lived in the parsonage years after the initial compact, knew that the evil of the devil's almanac was still active, still circulating within the walls. They hadn't tried to banish the ghost, they had tried to trap the curse itself. But the bottle was intact. The black wax seal was unbroken. It hadn't worked. Elias held the heavy, charged object, feeling the weight of that long-ago despair. The Puritan elders had buried their crime beneath the hidden well. The subsequent generations had built their lives on top of it. Yet the evil was so potent that someone, driven to the edge, had resorted to the very witchcraft their society condemned to ward off the consequences of their leader's own devilish compact. The witch bottle was silent testimony to a desperate, unrecorded resistance. A lone individual who knew the parsonage,
The contract, the almanac, the altar, the hidden well, and the historical motive, Reverend Stone's journal. Now he needed to know who in the present day was tending the debt. His research into Minister Thomas Lifford's notes led him to the only name that repeatedly appeared across 3 centuries of town records: the Blackwood family. They were the oldest, most respected lineage in Arkham's Ridge, instrumental in founding the first church and the town library, and consistently holding positions of power, from selectman to deacon. Currently, the town's most prominent elder was Deacon Alistair Blackwood, a man in his late 60s known for his gentle philanthropy, his encyclopedic knowledge of local history, and his unwavering dedication to preserving the town's colonial integrity. He was the one who had reluctantly granted Elias the archive access. Elias realized the grim irony. Deacon Blackwood was the public face of historical preservation, yet the curse was built on historical lies. Returning to the parsonage, Elias placed the Almanac and Silas's map side by side. He reread the deposition of Prudence Albright, whose forced confession implicated the original Deacon Alistair, the man she had refused. Then a chilling insight struck him. He examined the faint ancient handwriting, the pale ink on the 1690 Farmer's Almanac again, the script that wrote the words, "3 souls to the soil." It was the same distinct, spidery hand that appeared later in the church records in the late 19th century, correcting historical errors and, most damningly, in a few personal letters left on Uncle Silas's desk. The handwriting, though centuries apart, bore an identical rare characteristic, a specific flourish on the letter D and a peculiar loop on the capital B. It was the distinct script of the Blackwood family. Deacon Alistair Blackwood hadn't just studied the town's history, he had been actively, physically correcting it for decades, ensuring the documents only showed the town's piety, not its monstrous pact. He wasn't a historian, he was a gatekeeper, the current custodian of the Almanac's terrible ledger. Elias grabbed the original Deacon Alistair's portrait, a somber oil painting Silas had left leaning against the wall, and stared at the face of the man who had presided over Prudence's execution. The eyes were cold, calculating. Then Elias looked at a photograph of the current Deacon Blackwood on a newspaper clipping. The resemblance was striking, almost unnerving. The current deacon, the kindly elder, was not just a descendant, he was the latest inheritor of the family's awful duty. Blackwood wasn't guarding the almanac to destroy it, he was guarding it to maintain it. He was the one tending the curse, ensuring the generational blood tax was paid to keep Arkham's Ridge prosperous and secure. Elias felt a wave of nausea. The kindest man in town was the devil's accountant, preparing for the next scheduled payment, and Elias, by inheriting the parsonage, had just become a potential for the sacrifice. The revelation that Deacon Alistair Blackwood, the town's most benevolent face, was the custodian of the generational curse, stripped Elias of his last shred of comfort. He had discovered the Devil's Almanac, but the realization that the town was an active participant in its own doom left him isolated and terrified. Sleep, once a refuge, now became the new battleground. It began subtly, an oppressive sense of cold that settled in the parsonage even when the fires were lit. Then came the dreams. Every night Elias was transported. He didn't just witness the past, he experienced it. He wasn't in his dusty bed, he was standing.
Elias gathered the historical documents. The parsonage was built in the 1720s, decades after the hangings, when Arkham's Ridge was on the brink of economic collapse. Crops failing, fishing boats returning empty, and widespread sickness. Yet almost immediately after the parsonage was erected on the cursed soil, the town's fortunes had reversed with impossible speed. He cross-referenced the town ledgers with the years that followed the executions. The town received a sudden anonymous endowment in 1695 that saved their first bank. A seemingly worthless plot of land, condemned as barren, suddenly yielded rich iron ore. The Blackwood family, the lineage of the conspirators, became disproportionately wealthy, using that sudden fortune to secure political and economic power, thus ensuring the town's continuance. The original Puritan elders hadn't made the pact for power itself. They made it to buy stability, to ensure their flawed, fragile colonies survived the hostile New England environment. They paid with 3 innocent lives up front, and scheduled future payments with the demonic entity to maintain the covenant. Elias now understood the chilling financial structure of the curse. The haunting wasn't random, it was the collection mechanism. When the current generation's payment, one life, was due, the haunting intensified. The spirits were loosed, and the town's custodian, Deacon Blackwood, was compelled to deliver the sacrifice to preserve the town's wealth. The parsonage was the vault, the almanac the ledger, and the hidden well the deposit box. The current escalation of the haunting, the dreams, the discovery of the almanac, signaled that the debt was due now. Deacon Blackwood wasn't a zealot, he was a businessman protecting his inheritance by ensuring the next payment was made on time. Elias stared at the almanac. It was a receipt for blood, a dark form of colonial currency. The true horror was that the entire town, for generations, had been indirectly living off the blood money, implicitly agreeing to the terrifying terms of the covenant. Elias wasn't just fighting a ghost, he was fighting a deeply entrenched, financially beneficial, 3-century-old conspiracy. The only way to stop the next payment was to expose the truth and bankrupt the entire operation. The revelation of the debt, the Blackwood lineage's custodianship, and the terrifying recurrence of his dreams forced Elias to make the final, perilous connection. He turned to the Devil's Almanac, no longer viewing it as a historical relic, but as a satanic timetable. The angular runes, once incomprehensible, seemed to pulse with cold malice under the parsonage's oil lamp. He found the only full date written in the pale ink, the one that coincided with the excised pages in the Farmer's Almanac and the date of Prudence Albright's false confession. October 31st, 1689. It was a night the Puritans recognized as Samhain, or All Hallows' Eve, a date they fiercely condemned, but secretly feared. Yet Elias knew the elders would not choose a date based on pagan tradition unless it held astronomical significance they could exploit. Sifting through Minister Lyford's later sermons, which were filled with increasingly frantic warnings about celestial portents, Elias found a single marginal notation: the moon turned to blood, the sign of the pact's completion. Elias checked the historical astronomical records for New England in 1689. There it was, a documented though localized total lunar eclipse visible at moonrise on October 31st. The elders, already terrified by the previous decade's great comet, interpreted this crimson eclipse as the ultimate sign, either God's wrath or, to the conspirators, the devil's open door. The intense climax now played out vividly in Elias's mind.
"You cannot," Blackwood hissed, his voice tight with an urgency Elias had never heard. "The town's peace, the contract must be maintained. Give me the book." Blackwood lunged, but Elias rolled, keeping the almanac close. "Your peace is murder, Deacon. Your prosperity is blood money," Elias shouted, scrambling back toward the fire. "The debt is not paid, it's renewed." As Blackwood closed the distance, an impossible sound filled the air, the awful, stretched creak of a gallows rope. The silhouette of Prudence Albright, spectral and shimmering, coalesced between the two men, reaching a skeletal hand not for Elias, but toward the almanac, attempting to prevent its destruction. The elemental evil was fighting back. Elias ignored the ghost and the deacon, focusing only on the fire. He knew fire alone wouldn't destroy a demonic artifact. He needed an antidote. Recalling Minister Lyford's notes on unspoiled piety, he grabbed the only truly innocent object in the cursed house, the small iron crucifix he had torn from the church archives. He pressed the crucifix against the almanac's black hide binding. The book screamed, a high, unnatural sound that hurt Elias's teeth. The crucifix seared into the skin binding, leaving a smoking, indelible mark. The runes on the cover began to fade slightly. Gathering every ounce of his strength, he jammed the crucifix into the heart of the almanac,
forcing its spine to crack. With a final, desperate cry, he hurled the now damaged book into the heart of the roaring burn barrel. For a terrifying, agonizing minute, the fire did not consume the book. The book consumed the fire. The flames turned an impossible, sickly green, and the air around the barrel twisted violently. A roar of primal agony erupted from the hidden well beneath them. Then, with the sound like shattering glass and collapsing stone, the Almanac disintegrated, vanishing in a final black puff of sulphurous smoke that was instantly sucked down toward the ground. The sound of the invisible scraping rope abruptly ceased. The shimmering figure of Prudence Albright vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense stillness. The elemental evil was broken. The destruction of the Devil's Almanac was met not with a triumphant flash, but with an absolute, profound silence. The roaring fire in the burn barrel died instantly, leaving behind only smoldering ash and the metallic scent of extinguished sulfur. The unnatural chill that had permeated the parsonage for months vanished, replaced by the crisp, cool air of a normal New England night. Deacon Alistair Blackwood, stunned and broken, lay weeping on the cold grass, the weight of centuries of complicity finally crushing him. He was no longer a custodian of power, but a man who had failed his terrible, inherited duty. Elias left him there. The police would find him soon enough, and the local authorities would have to wrestle with an explanation that defied logic. The respected elder found catatonic on the grounds of the town's most cursed property. In the days that followed, the strange, pervasive prosperity of Arkham's Ridge began to steadily shift. It wasn't a sudden economic collapse, but a loss of its unnatural ease. The town council struggled with unexpected budget deficits. The Blackwood family's holdings, once mysteriously immune to market downturns, began to bleed money.